Like many other people out there, I have a strong affinity to music. I enjoy a lot of things in my life, but music has probably been the one I've taken to the most and stayed with the longest. Going all the way back to falling asleep to Mozart as a baby, as per my mother's stories anyway. At the least, I'd fall asleep to Mozart when I was sick during my younger school years. Something about it has just always been the thing for me. Though I've arguably wanted to be an author the longest of any career I've ever thought about in my life, there was a long period of time I wanted to make music for a living. Unfortunately, while I'm a pretty decent drummer and my singing voice isn't awful when I'm singing my own melodies, I simply do not have the inherent musical talent to do that, at least not unless I was in an environment with legitimate songwriters like my little brother. Even so, I'd say 9th grade was around when I started considering doing music with my life to some semi-serious degree. 8th grade before that was when I started exploring my own musical tastes in earnest. From pop-punk like Simple Plan to alt-metal like Disturbed and Breaking Benjamin to other stuff randomly thrown in there over those early years like Avenged Sevenfold and a little Five Finger Death Punch, I was exploring some of the big-name entry-level metal artists. I eventually, quote-unquote, outgrew many of those early tastes and shifted over time into metalcore in the back half of my sophomore year of high school, due in very large part to From Ashes to New, which led me indirectly to Trivium, who became a favorite for a few years. As I slowly got more and more into the modern metalcore sound with We Came as Romans, and especially the era of Crown the Empire that had Dave doing unclean vocals, I came to realize just what music I think I really loved. Late 2018 was when my adoration for metalcore really came into fruition. Even though my favorite bands weren't really that 2010s metalcore that I loved, the vast majority of what I listened to at the time was exactly that, my favorite genre of music. But if you're at all into metalcore, you know that deathcore is basically right there knocking on your door. It took me a lot longer to grapple with that genre, however, because I still wasn't in absolute love with unclean vocals yet. Part of why I loved metalcore was the breakdowns and the aggression intermixed with soaring choruses and catchy melodies. The fact that deathcore very often completely abandons the melodic side of music that makes me love metalcore, yeah, it was a tough sell for a long time. In 2019, I finally decided I was ready to venture into deathcore. It was still a pretty slow introduction, with my gateways being some of the simpler and easier to get into bands, but I was slowly making my way in there. To no one's surprise, the vocals were often what could push me away, so my preferences were often vocalists who weren't constantly doing gymnastics with their sounds and doing excessively crazy things. Bands like Thy Art Is Murder and Fit for an Autopsy were thus pretty great for me getting into the genre. I'd say Dear Desolation from the former and The Great Collapse from the latter, both released in 2017, alongside Shadow of Intent's 2019 album Melancholy, were some of the earliest gateway albums for me where deathcore is concerned. But I will never forget what was actually my very first deathcore album. The Valley by Whitechapel. The Valley wasn't too much for me musically, and Phil Bozeman's vocal decisions on that record were far from scaring me away, even if they occasionally got to be a bit much for me at the time. But the fact that the instrumentals and Phil both knew when to incorporate certain softer and or melodic sections here and there was a big part of me understanding that maybe metalcore and deathcore aren't that different, and that all I needed was time to get into the genre as a whole. That's why I went into Thy Art Is Murder as one of the biggest names in deathcore and Fit for an Autopsy as one of Matt Heafy's favorite bands next. For reference, Matt Heafy is the vocalist and rhythm guitarist of Trivium. His recommendation of The Great Collapse was actually my first exposure to deathcore back in late 2017, but let's just say I was not ready for Hydra as an opening track for that album, and quickly noped out despite wanting to get into it someday. The Valley didn't mark the entire end of my journey with Whitechapel at the time, but I'm not super familiar with their entire catalog either. I did listen to every one of their albums in 2019, several of them a few times, but they definitely weren't my favorite. This Is Exile was probably my favorite record the band put out besides The Valley itself, but aside from the album that introduced me to the band, Mark of the Blade was probably the one I listened to the most because I had easiest access to it, and that's a long story, we don't need to get into it here. In all, I would say I generally enjoyed Whitechapel, but they most certainly weren't my favorite, much as I credit them for being my gateway into deathcore. Jump to 2021 when Kin dropped, and you see a relatively controversial album reception. There is definitely a solid chunk of Whitechapel's fan base that isn't into the more dynamic soundscape that The Valley and Kin, and the story the two albums tell together, provide, but there's plenty of others who are fans. I am one of those. I can't lie and say I listened to Kin a ton, because I didn't, but that's largely because I wasn't in a deathcore mood around that time. I was on a pretty heavy kick of Coheed and Cambria around then, listening to way too much of them and pretty much literally nothing else. So yeah, I don't know how well I got my point across. I like Whitechapel. I like some of their popular early material, aside from their debut anyway. I don't remember enjoying that at all at the time. And I enjoy the more recent stuff too. Hell, I needed an album like The Valley to really get into deathcore. If every one of the albums these guys put out was The Somatic Defilement and This Is Exile, it would have taken at least a couple more years for me to get into deathcore. Well, maybe Fit for an Autopsy would have still been good for me, but the what-ifs aren't the point. With altogether way too much exposition out of the way, I have to say that I was looking forward to a new album. I was both worried and excited by the pronouncements of band members that they were going brutal and quote-unquote ignorantly heavy again, just like everybody else was. Worried because every band ever has said, oh, this is our heaviest shit to date, just to release, well, nowhere near their heaviest album, even if some of those cases are still perfectly good records, which isn't always the case. It still gets annoying to set the wrong expectations that way. Excited because who doesn't want another This Is Exile, right? So the wait began, and eventually in the back half of 2024, A Visceral Wretch released as the first single. I wasn't super into it. I liked the song, don't get me wrong, but it also wasn't exactly what I wanted from a single. So after a couple of spins, I set to waiting for more music again. Several months went by while everybody waited. Finally, in January of this year, Hymns and Dissonance was announced, and the title track was released as the second single. This time, I was really into it. In fact, Hymns and Dissonance was hitherto my favorite single of 2025, leading up to the drop of this album. That's how much I loved the song. I really liked how it blended certain specific aspects of what a lot of other bands in the genre were doing in the wake of Lorna Shore's explosion without ever actually diving into that sound in totality, and all the other elements on top just came together brilliantly. The song sounded massive, yet never cluttered, and that finalized my excitement for the album. Surprisingly, no third single was released ahead of the album release, standing in direct contrast to nearly the entirety of the music industry at this point. I really appreciated that move. But worth noting, however, is that the second single, the album's title track, came with the album announcement and a little information about what it actually was. I gotta say, from a conceptual perspective, I love the idea of the oxymoronic hymns and dissonance. Hymns are indeed typically more upbeat pieces of music, most often associated with the content of church, frequently Christianity. Dissonance, on the other hand, usually describes darker and dingier soundscapes, aspects of purposeful clashing. To stick these words together in the title and make it central to the thematic palette of the album? Well, let's just say I was really intrigued. But now, 9 or 10 minutes into this purported review, perhaps I ought to consider actually reviewing the album, right? Well, in short, Hymns and Dissonance verges so close to perfect and inches even closer with every re-listen that to say it is in fact perfect may as well simply be the truth. At least, that's how I feel about it. And there's a lot of things that come together to make it so. First of all, it is more than simply the album being some return to form as so many fans are praising, though they aren't necessarily wrong to say so. It is a massive shift back to a more iconic sound when compared to The Valley and Kin. That much is obviously true. But I'm not going to assert that what the band was doing with those two records is inherently any better or worse than what came before or after, as maybe some others are. Bluntly said, while I adore Hymns and Dissonance, the fact it is some kind of return to form is not the reason it is so good. As I said, there's more to it. Beginning with the music itself, I have a hard time understanding how one could listen to this album, as a deathcore fan, mind you, and not be impressed. The diversity here is off the chain. Between a lengthy build-up before diving in the deep end, an outro that sounds nothing like the rest of the album to make a thematic point, and the sheer variety of deathcore elements utilized throughout to varying degrees, I never felt like Hymns and Dissonance wasn't fresh and switching things up at exactly the right moments. The riffs are distinct and never repetitive, and take influence from basically all the different eras of deathcore's existence, without ever being a shitty mishmash of random incoherent ideas. They're punchy and groovy where they deserve to be, but they don't forget to include blast beats for flavor when they make sense, and all the rest of it. The transitions into and out of breakdowns are simply flawless all around, never relegating them to token inclusions solely for the sake of existing, but rather being inherent pieces of the journey. The various instrumental building blocks always complement each other and never overshadow the rest of the package. And these are just the most prominent pieces of the album. Intermixed in the very deathcore-coded riffs and breakdowns and drumming and everything else is some genuinely effective and creepy ambiance, yielding a masterful atmosphere that suits the storytelling of the album perfectly, yet knows when to include subversively beautiful moments as well, most particularly in the closer, again to suit the story. Each song flows from one to the next without being jarring and without feeling so similar as to be redundant, but also bringing back melodies and motifs that, while not identical to previous songs, are close enough to remind you of the structure of the story and embed that in your mind. As a rule, the crafting of the music of this record is brutal and intense, but it is also creepy and unsettling at points, and masterful no matter what moment you pick out from the rest. The production is super consistent, apparently done by one of the band's guitarists. Amazing work if so. This record is absolutely massive and never once muddy or cluttered. With as much as is going on in this one, that's no easy feat. Furthermore, something I appreciate about Hymns and Dissonance is that it doesn't completely reject a couple of the modernisms of what deathcore has been doing since Lorna Shore really blew up in 2021. I bet a lot of fans will deny it, and a lot of other people will hate the comparison out of stubborn principle, but the breakdown of the title track and several musical ideas in the penultimate track, plus the transition of the final track's first few minutes into its last few minutes, are reminiscent of some of the blackened elements that other bands have used and overused in the past few years. Despite this, they don't phone in these moments, nor make them so in your face as to be super noticeable. For example, the moments I vaguely call out, I only noticed in my numerous re-listens to the album, and not on my first spin. As I said before, the crafting of the music on Hymns and Dissonance is incredible, and I love every second of it. But no small part of why I love that is because of the story it tells and enhances. And on the topic of storytelling itself, Phil is honestly kind of a genius. Being able to tell a coherent story isn't easy in the first place. Doing as much in the field of music is harder because if the lyrical story doesn't align with the tonal story of the music, you can end up with some heavy mismatch that makes it hard to really love. But Phil manages to keep his performance in line with the rest of the band to such an absurdly impressive degree, I hardly know how to praise it properly. Well, I guess I'll start briefly with Phil's performance itself. I can't really say much on this front that hasn't been said before, so I'll get it out of the way. Phil Bozeman has presence like no other. I am convinced it is impossible to listen to Phil's average screams and not be blown away by them. And by average, mind you, I mean his typical style that he utilizes the most, not average in terms of quality. As I say, his sheer presence is insane, and he absolutely kills the performance of this record. In the very good way. He has somehow managed to perfect the balance of vocal variation without it being reasonable to accuse him of simply exercising vocal gymnastics. pun not intended. Don't get me wrong, I love Mia Will Ramos, but Phil Bozeman strikes the match and really puts this record ablaze. If there's any individual element that could be said to overshadow the rest in the construction of Hymns and Dissonance, the vocals is that element. Even most of the reviews I've seen that have somehow been lukewarm on the album as a whole still praise Phil's performance. Yet the performance is nowhere near the totality of what's on offer here. What got me is the storytelling. I love concept albums. As soon as there are multiple facets for me to dig into over a full album journey that actively encourages and rewards listening to an album in full rather than just a random song here or there, I'm sold. I've tried many artists I otherwise wouldn't have just on account of concept albums, Coheed and Cambria being a prime example. Though Hymns and Dissonance is not Whitechapel's first foray into concept albums, it is arguably them perfecting that very, dare I say, concept entire, pun absolutely intended this time around. I talked about how the musicality of the record complements the actual story of it earlier. Well, what is the story in the first place? Wikipedia isn't exactly the best source most of the time, but this paragraph on the album's page is very concise. The story follows a cultist as he announces his purpose and ordains his followers to perform obscene rituals to open a portal for him to walk through. He leaves them to continue with their rituals and indulge in violence as he ventures forth, disdaining light and holiness. He goes to his brother's grave to mock him for his lack of evil and endeavors to fulfill his dark purposes before ending up dissipating in a void. There's more to the story than that, and it's not exactly a delicate explanation, but it's a solid blueprint to work from as you listen and follow along to the lyrics. I personally love how in-depth the story gets without being bogged down in useless details. Phil leaves plenty to the listener's imaginations in all the right places at all the right times, but keeps the story clearly legible and compelling throughout. It's not very complex, but lets you fill in the gaps and details quite often. And to bring up the music again, the tone and atmosphere of the instrumental is instrumental in evoking the imagery of the story itself. It truly is fantastic, limited and easy to follow, yet vast and open to interpretation. I also appreciate that no explicit quote-unquote message seems to be being made in the telling either. As a Christian who grew up in a rather strict household, I had to listen to all the metal I listened to in secret in the first place, but if my mother got a hold of the lyrical transcripts of Whitechapel albums, let alone Hymns and Dissonance today, I can guarantee I'd be in super deep shit. Understandably so, actually. Without the context of this being a concept album, Phil definitely does come across as glorifying evil and satanic imagery and worship. But of course, this is not the first time Whitechapel has delved into these kinds of themes. The point is that the story is dark, and it hits on some pretty disturbing things at times. But you know something? That's awesome. For the same reason that people love the horror genre in film, TV, and gaming, and definitely in books, I find the story of Hymns and Dissonance compelling. One need not actively glorify evil to understand and take heed of a story based in the themes and topics therein. Without getting too into details, it is the simple truth that the lyrical composition of this album is top-notch and never makes me uncomfortable because I can appreciate the story and dig into my own thoughts on the ideas embedded along within them for myself. As I said before, the story is open to interpretation in all the right ways. I'm absolutely certain that there are actual Satanists who adore this album as much as I, a Christian, do. Such is the versatility of art. I commend Phil for the execution of this aspect and the band entire for making everything fit together so well. Side note, I should mention that I love the lyrical moments where it seems like Phil's not speaking English. These moments are crafted by a few of the written lines being reversed in an exceedingly unique fashion. Rather than playing audio backwards or just speaking some overused Latin gobbledygook, the individual words within the lines in question are reversed, and Phil pronounces them as such. As an example, this portion of the title track. The creativity on this record is something else, man. P.S. I'm almost sure this isn't a strictly new idea, but within the story it just tickles the author and me to see things done this way. All in all, I love every single song on Hymns in Dissonance. My first listen yielded some standout tracks, sure, but my second listen and onward revealed to me that all of them are phenomenal and serve their purpose brilliantly. Hell, my favorite song, though I'm pretty sure it's Bedlam, changes with almost every listen as well. That alone is a testament to how dynamic this body of work, this work of art, is. I absolutely love Hymns in Dissonance, and I'm glad to see it getting the reception it has been receiving. So it turns out I didn't actually say what I wanted to say in the introduction, which was originally titled What This Part Is Now Titled. I spent a lot of words just briefly going over a small portion of my history with music, but I never ended up explaining to you why I love music. So I guess let me try to do that now. Music touches my soul in ways that scarcely anything else does. I enjoy the occasional film, I love video games, and I do a lot of reading too, and I review various pieces of all of the above media at times between this channel and my main one. But music, specifically metal, even more specifically core, has had a vice grip on my psyche for years. I don't ever see that changing. When I really fell in love with core music in late 2018, plenty of that was great music. Plenty more of it was individual emotional songs that hit me personally in a place that allowed me to let out emotions I otherwise felt like were impossible to release. Beyond these aspects, the albums I tended to love the most out of everything were for the most part concept albums. Of course, not all of them were, but when I think about the stories I fell in love with alongside the music, I'm reminded of the version of me that lived those stories myself, like reading a book or playing a game, but with a songwriting aspect that no other medium can really touch on in the same way. I'm reminded of those stories that I latched onto and have adored for years, deepening and expanding my relationship to the music itself. Some of those stories were more personal, like In Moment in Memory by Our Hollow Our Home. Some of those stories were for the love of a compelling story in spite of what my mother might say, like Claustrophobic by Before I Turn. Some of those stories I could so vividly imagine as a movie so as to be more immersive than most of the movies I did watch at the time, like Resistance: Rise of the Runaways by Crown the Empire. Outside of core, there were stories that I didn't altogether understand but loved being immersed in a world, like basically all of those by Coheed and Cambria, or which fascinated the songwriter that I could only ever dream to be, like Juggernaut by Periphery. Hell, there are stories I wrote in my mind to instrumental albums like all of Andromeda's pre-2020 albums and EPs. In the end, if I were to compose a top 25 albums of all time list, I'm fairly certain half or more of those would be concept albums of one sort or another. Beyond the musicality, when there's a comprehensible and compelling story to go with it, I fall into an entirely different kind of love. When I spoke in the intro about wanting to be a musician for a portion of my life, I didn't just want to write music, I wanted to write concept albums. I wanted to write multi-record stories that would tell as much of a story in the music as they would in the lyrics, maybe even with multiple purposeful interpretations to the stories, because that's the kind of stuff I loved. Obviously, that never quite came into fruition, and I can be reasonably certain that it never will. But in a time of my life, the past year or two, where most of my music listening is relegated to new releases, playing most of them once or maybe twice and never again, discovering new artists and styles and expanding my horizons, I've realized it's gotten to be pretty rare that an album really hooks me, or that it really evokes my love for music. The reason I reviewed Hymns in Dissonance is because it did that. It's the first album of 2025 to scream to me that I needed to review it. I not only loved it musically, but it had a story that I could dig into, and I became obsessed in a way I don't often do with music anymore. Re-listening to new albums repeatedly is something I rarely do anymore, which is kind of a sad admission. Sure, I'll listen to a few albums a second time to solidify my opinion, but not often more than that. But Whitechapel changed that with Hymns and Dissonance. 5 times in as many days isn't that much even still, but it's a lot for me these days. I started doing Music Mania every Monday on this channel so that I could talk about music without that being limited to the small handful of in-depth reviews that I feel notably compelled to write. Sometimes I'd write reviews on albums I thought I should, even if I didn't necessarily want to. 2025 has been weird for me in that I've been able to enjoy this new Music Mania series, but I've had to wonder for the past couple months if it itself was making it impossible for me to do in-depth reviews like this. I often thought about how I simply wasn't compelled to write any, even for notable releases, like New Architects as one single example. Then Whitechapel came around and reminded me that I can, and that I should. But not just that I should for some vague obligatory nonsense, but rather because I want to. Because of this record, I can go through the rest of the year confident that if I quote-unquote need to review an album in this standalone format separate from Music Mania, I'll know it naturally, and it'll probably be because I actually love it. After all, that's why I reviewed Sleep Tokens Take Me Back to Eden nearly 2 years ago now, which is really weird to think about. I was seeking precisely that love for music I hadn't realized I was losing. Whitechapel's Hymns and Dissonance reminded me why I love music.